Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Diffusing Conflict in the Library webinar hosted by the South Central Regional Library Council. I'm Jessica Philippe, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Carrie Rogers Whitehead. Carrie is a library consultant, trainer, and author based out of Utah, and she gave a great presentation last year for us on preventing workplace burnout. So I'd like to welcome you back, Carrie.
Thank you. Oh, are we ready to go, Jessica?
Yep, we're all set.
Awesome.
And just let me know when you need me to advance slides.
So Jessica has to do a little more heavy lifting this presentation because she is sharing her slides. So we apologize for the technical difficulties. I'll just have to give Jessica a heads up when it's time to move. But if I pause for dramatically for a second, that's probably your cue as well.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Jessica. And please, like Jessica said, write in the chat box. I will check in a few times during this presentation. I really like to get your input and things that you care and that you're seeing. And then at the end, I'll leave a few minutes for questions as well. So, but let's get going, and excited to be here. So we'll move to the next slide. So this is my contact information. I'm happy to talk with you a little bit more about this. As Jessica says, it was great talking about burnout and fatigue, and I've also presented on things like passive-aggressive behavior, which I know is a big issue, and we'll touch a little bit on that today. But as you can see in the next slide, this is kind of what we're going to be summarizing, and this is a big topic. I was telling this to Jessica. I'm like, should I focus on patrons or coworkers or managers, or what should I focus on? And so Jessica's like, focus on everything. And so you're gonna
I remember said all of the above.
All of the above. So you're going to get kind of like a taste, I guess, on some of these topics because they are big. So I might just pull out one kind of concept for certain things. And so you might be like, Harry, why didn't you address this or this? Because this is a big issue, and it's an issue that affects all of us. So yes, I can't cover everything, but I pulled things that I felt that were most relevant for libraries to talk about today. I do have scripts, a little bit more, some specifics towards the end to kind of give you some practical guidelines for this webinar. And on a personal note, I started training on verbal judo and conflict, particularly teen conflict, back in like 2008. My job was as a teen services librarian, and I had 150 kids after school. We had a cop on site every day. There was gang conflicts and drugs and fights and kids skateboarding through the library, and I was a brand new kind of newish librarian, and I was like, what do I do? And no one ever trained me to do any of this in library school. I kind of had to figure it out a lot on my own, and these strategies that I'm going to tell you were things that I had to figure out on the fly and I used in practice. So I'm not, there are some academic things, but a lot of what I'm going to share with you I did myself with teenagers and adults. So I hope that it's practical and helpful for you as well. So we'll move to the next slide and we'll kind of dive in. And I wanted to kind of start with this quote to give everyone kind of an idea of this mindset, and a theme that I'm talking about here is that no one really likes conflict, but it's like, it's like the dirty dishes. If you ignore the dishes too long, they start to stink. You can't ignore it forever. We don't like dishes, so we're like, oh, tomorrow, the next day, but they don't go away. So we get stuck in our seclusions. We get stuck and things start to stink after a while. So this webinar is not necessarily about avoiding conflict. It's about confronting it and trying to prevent some of that conflict. So we'll go forward here. So as I said, we want to handle it better because, like, things, I like to say resentment is our stinky dishes. Resentment's kind of this toxicity. It's like this cloud that just grows and grows and grows. And I have been in work environments, I don't know if you have, and you can share and chat there, where there's resentment and this like underlying low level of negativity. And it's like Jello. You can't really put your finger on it. You kind of feel it, but you can't name it. And it's really hard to work in that environment. I've had coworkers where you're just kind of walking on eggshells a little bit around them because you're avoiding conflict, or you're not talking or addressing things, and the dishes start to stink a little bit. So we're going to do our best. Conflict is unavoidable, but we're going to try to work here in this webinar to help you understand it. And partly I started off today, just one big part of understanding conflict is knowing the effects on our brains and our bodies. And these are some concepts that I talked about when we talked about burnout and compassion fatigue too, because it does affect our brains. You know, stress on the brain, and anyone who's in a library can kind of feel this. You have a lot of things being thrown at you at once. You're often reactive instead of proactive. And this really can affect you. If you're constantly in this stressful situation with adrenaline and cortisol, those hormones are flooding through your body. Your body doesn't know the difference between an angry patron and a tiger. It's going to react the same way. So when we keep having these hits of adrenaline and cortisol, we have glucose going through our bloodstream that gets us energized, like it gets us ready to go and gets us ready to fight. But if you have it constantly all the time, then you have all of these other physical issues like diabetes, heart disease, weight gain, anxiety, depression, lack of sleep, all of these kind of things that have a thinning of the frontal cortex. So on this one, that I was just hearing this study, I've been listening to the new Malcolm Gladwell book, Talking to Strangers, and there's a section in that book that talks about prisoners that they would torture, and they would put in high stress environments. They would deprive them from sleep, for sleep. They would do other kind of things to them, and then they tested them out, the U.S. military, with their own officers before testing it out on prisoners. And what they found was, under this stress, this trauma they were experiencing, they were finding high gaps of memory loss. And so there's this interview in the book that the scientist talks about this person who just saw them 20 minutes ago, kind of mentally blacked out under that stress and couldn't even remember them. So when we are in those high traumatic stress for long periods of time, coupled with sleep deprivation and other things, now of course you're not being tortured at the library. Let's hope that it's not that stressful, but it actually can affect your cognitive functioning. They would have these people, after going through this traumatic stress, try to color and do different cognitive tasks, and it was like their brain kind of reverted to prepubescent mode. They forgot things. They were acting a little bit differently. It really, really does affect us in a biological way that we need to think about. So let's go on to some other things of the effects of conflict. So our brain's response to stress. So this is just kind of our steps to think about in a step. So our amygdala, I like the term smoke detector. It's that part of our brain that sounds the alarm. So then we have that adrenaline and cortisol, which I mentioned, that has all of those physical effects. So this is why those prisoners in that story and the patients in that story I was telling you about had that memory loss and cognitive abilities, because our amygdala shuts down those pathways to our prefrontal cortex, and that's the part of our brain that makes those long-term decisions, that thinks, is the rational decision maker, and it stops it. We have memory loss sometimes when we're only operating with our limbic systems, the back part of our brain. So in addition to that chemical response, we have those physical responses: sweaty palms, shallow breathing, throat constriction, attention narrows, glucose is going through the brains. And so it's this kind of three steps response. And so it is hard when we are in those conflict situations and we are highly stressed to make rational decisions, which is why I suggest that I have these scripts, because a lot of it goes out the window. We're in that stressful, like, we can know these things intellectually, but our prefrontal cortex isn't working. So sometimes in therapy and traumatic PTSD treatments, they have people memorize scripts and narratives and practice them in their heads. So think about that a little bit when we go into it. You're going to learn a lot here, but then half of it might go out of the window when you're stressed. And we have a lot of stress in our lives, and I thought this stat was interesting. And you don't have to raise your hand or comment on this, but about a third of American employees report their bosses are the greatest source of stress. A lot of our stress doesn't come as much from colleagues, but from managers. And that's an even trickier situation, because you have less control over that when your boss or your manager is in stress. So when I trained on passive aggressive behavior, I had people ask me, and I was doing research in this area, what do you do when your boss is the one that has the most passive aggressive behavior? And the advice that I saw and that I gave in that training was leave, because you have a lack of control. And this is hard stuff. You do your best, but when it is management that's causing the greatest source of stress, your options are a little bit more limited. And leadership changes, organizational changes, 80%. And we are going through a lot of those organizational and leadership changes with technology changes. And so if you're in a county or a city, a new mayor comes in, a new director comes in, there's a constant churn of changes that can just be a constant source of stress. So if anyone wants to share any of their experiences, I don't know if you want to talk about your boss in this recorded webinar here, I can say that I have been in those situations where, yes, my boss was my greatest source of stress at the library, and it is hard. It is really rough. So we'll go to the next slide there. So we can't always control our bosses, but we can do a little bit more when we have some conflict with colleagues, people kind of on the same playing field, or working with people you're stuck with. So there's a lot of things I can cover on this, but I'm going to hone in on just a few different things about reframing your emotions. So at the end of this webinar, I have a references and resources page that will tell you kind of where I got some of this information, and I have a book list, and one of the book lists, the book is The Upside of Your Dark Side, and so some of this what I'm sharing here is from that book, Upside of Your Dark Side, and it's all about reframing your emotions and how negative personality traits can be a positive thing. And truly, we can't change people, but we can change how we react to them. And it's sometimes helpful to look at maladaptive behavior that's adaptive in certain situations. So, and this happened to me personally with a coworker who is more of a detail-oriented person than I am. I am more of like a big picture. Let's do it now. Yeah, let's do it. I'm that, and I don't always pause to think about all the implications. So, this coworker and I, she would push back on some of my ideas, and I was taking it the wrong way. I was taking it personal. Like, why don't you like my ideas? But her brain was more, she had higher, as she said, it had higher rates of anxiety. She is more detail oriented. So her pushing back was how her brain worked, and my brain worked differently. And so I could choose to believe that it was a personal attack, or I could choose to look at that a little differently. But things were hard. We actually had to have a mediation. But after that mediation, I understood a little bit more on how her brain worked, and she understood how my brain worked, that I'm not like I don't care about what she's saying. I just look at things a little different. Although I left the library a few years ago, we're still friends, because we just understood that our emotions and how we handle things are different. But something that to ask yourself, and you can ask this question with not just coworkers but other relationships: if nothing changed with this coworker, could you work with them? And I think in most situations you could. You could find something, some common ground, or do mediation, or do some kind of, let's just deal with this conflict. But there are situations where maybe it is too much, and then you have to look at, well, this person I have to go in with the assumption that this person will never ever change. So I learn to work with them, or I need to move. That's a hard situation, but people can change, but it's easier to change ourselves. So we'll go to the next slide there. There we go. So I mentioned this a little bit with my story of an anxiety. I'd worked with someone who was, very open about, high levels and high rates of anxiety. And that can be a very positive thing. And I learned over time that this coworker's anxiety helped kind of temper my big picture, let's go gung-ho, bulldoze into things, because it had me think and take a step back and do things a little more strategic, better. So I like this is also from Upside of the Dark Side, is when happy people were 50% more likely to recall words they hadn't seen. So happier people are less detail-oriented. They depend on stereotypes. They're deceived easier as well. People who are anxious are looking out ahead. They're a little further down the road. They're catching things that people don't always want to see. They help you prevent possible conflict because they might say, oh, well, this person, this is going on, and they can take steps. So this is the term defensive pessimism. The gloomy person is probably, has a reason to do that. And that's one of the focus of that book, is that maladaptive behavior can be adaptive in certain situations. Maybe the past experience taught them that I should be a little bit more pessimistic because I am hurt less and things suck less when I expect less. So it can be adaptive in certain situations. So you could maybe go in, there's a leadership change going on, instead of being that like super optimistic person who's deceived, say, okay, well, there's a new leadership coming, there's a new boss coming, and I'm going to be open to the change, but I'm going to also understand that there's going to be some things I don't like. This is going to hurt. This is not going to be fun. And so defensive pessimism can help temper our expectations and be adaptive in certain situations and actually help us handle things better. Whenever there's a big gap between expectations, when you go into a movie and you have very high expectations, then you crash a little bit more, right? If you went in with, well, maybe the movie's good, maybe it's not, well, you're not going to be as disappointed. That's the term defensive pessimism. Next slide. And so some of you might look at this slide and you're like, how could anything be good about narcissists? Well, here's a few things. And narcissists are everywhere. They're in the private sector, they're in the public sector, they're in all sorts of jobs. They're around us. There are places for narcissists. They might push us to do things outside of our comfort zone. They can be more creative and innovative, and they can kind of, if you have a narcissist that loves your project and you're okay with kind of letting them take the lead, they might push that project and make it happen because they can be a little more charming and good at convincing others. Now, I'm not saying in any of this that these are necessary. I'm not attaching a moral judgment of good and bad. I'm saying that if we reframe how we look at some of these personality traits, it is easier to work with people with these personality traits. If I can find one thing good in this tough situation, it makes my life easier. So if I could look at a narcissist instead of just seeing the negative, I could use that strategically. I could say, well, you know what, they might have some really good ideas, and that would be easier to work with a person like that. Next slide. So valuing these emotions is what I'm trying to say with colleagues. That's one step that we can avoid our conflict by reframing how we feel about these things, not taking it personally. Their anxiety, their pushback, there is not necessarily personal, and recognizing that these people are teams that have these different personalities can help make us more diverse and well-rounded and a better team. So this other quote on sadness, leaders who display sadness actually help teams kind of look and dive in with the details a little bit. So we have a kind of American culture of just positivity all the time, but there is a place for a little bit of our dark side as well. We'll go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit more about management. And as I said, you can't always control what your boss does. You have your sphere of influence is smaller. But those that are in management should be aware of their stress is contagious. So I have been in a situation with a boss like this and felt it firsthand. And if any of you want to chat and share some of your thoughts on this topic or your experiences, you can please chime in. So I had a manager who was dealing with some health problems and some issues at home. And it was like she brought it to work every day, and it really kind of it was this gloom, this mist that kind of permeated a lot of things. I was afraid to bring up complaints. I was afraid to bring up problems. And it wasn't just me. The staff would just be like, oh, well, we're just gonna handle it because she's sad, And that's not always a thing to do, because then we got into situations where she would be upset that she didn't know anything. And it wasn't like we were trying to keep things from her. She just was very, depressed, so we wouldn't tell her, and then it made it worse. I don't know if everyone's been in those situations, but management stress is contagious. If you are in charge, look, life happens and things suck, but if you go to work with that kind of attitude, you affect those around you more than someone else. I mean, anyone's bad mood can affect their colleagues, but particularly from management. If managers don't know how to handle conflict and stress, it makes it worse for everyone. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to pause, and I don't know if Jessica, if you can see if there's any chats or comments or questions that you want to add here. So we went through some brain science, some conflict with colleagues and managers, or questions or thoughts.
No questions so far.
Okay, well, I wanted to pause, and I'll pause after this next section as well, and we'll also have some time at the end to talk about this. So these are tough things, especially tough with managers, and if you're having a bad day, manager, do your best. Don't bring it with you as much as you can. Okay, so I know you're definitely dealing with some of this with conflict with patrons. As I said, providing the best customer service through gritted teeth. So let's dive into patrons a little bit more. If you want to add.
We did just get one comment.
Gotcha.
So
yeah.
Some sadness can be beneficial, but too much, especially in the supervisor, can be detrimental. Yes.
Yes, yeah, and it's that balance. Like, so narcissists in some ways can be, inspiring and innovative, but into excess, they're like, you want to get away from them. Anxiety can be in some settings, oh wow, it's catching details, but when it gets overwhelming, then it affects other people. So it's a hard balance, and I would say some of it is the situation that you're in. If you have other stresses going on in the library on top of that, then that's maybe a place to kind of grit your teeth and smile a little bit more. If it's a little more calmer, then it's an environment that people can handle that some more. So we are all products of the systems and environment we're in too. So yeah, it's tough, but as long as we don't attach a moral judgment, like if you are sad, it is bad. Does that make sense? Like we don't say that is just a sad person, or that is just an anxious person, that we recognize that a lot of their anxiety comes from the environment they're in. Okay, we'll dive into some more conflict with patrons, and yes, you can add chat comments or other questions, and as we move forward. Do you want to move to the next slide? Okay, I love the Gottmans. I don't know if any of you have read some of Dr. John and Julie Gottman's work. They're marriage researchers, and you're like, why am I? But they do a lot around communication. So they studied for a couple of decades. They would observe couples as they talked, and one of the famous things from the Gottmans is the 4 horsemen of divorce, is what they call it. Is that when couples were in their observations were displaying contempt, criticism, defensiveness, or stonewalling, they could predict with fairly high accuracy that if this person was headed for a divorce. So I include some Gottman quotes and some Gottman concepts in this section because they focus so much on communication. And even if you're not married to someone, you probably are with your coworkers more than your spouse or your partner. When you really think about it, we got 40 hours a week or more with sometimes these people. So a lot of this research and this work can pertain to what you're doing. So they talk a lot about communication, and there's in Gottman's research, there's a lot of scripts that people can use, and I'm going to include a script in this presentation too. But first I'm going to talk about diffusing conflict. When I say diffusing, I mean it's a little bit fiery, right? So when the conflict has already happened. I'm not preventing it. It's happening right now. So these are some steps to diffuse the conflict with patrons. So this is a hard one, is that when we are in a conflict or stressful situations, part of our brain starts tuning out to protect ourselves, right? We're uncomfortable. So I'm going to think about this or focus on this. But if a patron doesn't feel that you are listening to them, then that can make them angrier. Have you ever been in a situation like that? You're complaining to the customer service rep or whatever it is, and they're just tuned out? Well, then you're madder, and it's just escalated. So staying present and listening is a big thing there too. This is something actually recommended a lot with the Gottman approach. When there is conflict, ask questions. Don't make judgments, ask questions. It really does calm people down when you react instead of with contempt or criticism or defensiveness or stonewalling, to react with curiosity. What's causing this? And it really, it pauses things a little bit. And the final, in general, final step is focusing on your body and breathing, because although our face might be pleasant as we're trying to stay present, our hands might be gritted, our face might be contorted, our body language can send another message. So even if we are trying to listen to patrons, and this is very, very hard, if our nonverbal communication is disagreeing with our verbal communication, it still can escalate that conflict as if we weren't listening to them. You kind of know when someone's being patronizing to you. Someone can smile at you, and you know they're pissed. Does that make sense? So we have to we want to do our best to match our nonverbal and our verbal communication. We'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to spend some time with teens, not just because I worked in teen services, but because a lot of conflict in the library can come from teenagers, God bless them. That they're a unique group because, as we mentioned earlier, on the prefrontal cortex, that's that type of the part of our brain that helps us make the rational decision makers, theirs isn't fully developed. And there's some other things going on with our teen patrons. So that term dopamine, that's the pleasure center of our brain. Teens have higher highs and lower lows with dopamine. This is actually one reason that, like, when you're age 15, you remember things very well. Has anyone experienced that? Like, I don't know what I did last week, but I remember that time when I was 15 and the song came on the radio and I cried and I was very sad. Or I remember that particular, you remember maybe your first kiss, or you remember those high emotional moments, because when we do have higher levels of dopamine going through our body, it actually enhances, that our memories, we remember it very well because it was intense. So this is also a reason that when you have a teenager saying that this is the worst thing ever that's happened to me and my life feels like it's over, they are experiencing emotions much higher than you are, because we're like, what's the big deal? But their dopamine levels are higher. When they say this is the biggest thing that's happened to them, they're telling the truth. Their brains feel like it. So keeping that in mind, and this is something I would emphasize, is that dopamine makes them want to take, they don't feel things the same way. They will get more upset about things than you might dismiss, and they feel more invalidated when you might try to dismiss them. So other things on teens is that they're highly influenced by their their peers, and this actually this peaks around age 10 to 14 is when teenagers feel mostly influenced by their peers. They care the most, and you might have seen this. There is a big difference between a 7th grader and an 11th grader. A 7th grader really, really wants to fit in. They dress alike, they talk alike. By the time they get like 11th and 12th grade, they've kind of discovered their identity a little bit more. So when particular you're working with junior high students, being very careful about how you talk to them in a group. If you reprimand a group, all of them should have the same consequences. And yes, maybe one is doing things worse, but they are so highly influenced by their peers that you need to let them have the last word and kind of take them privately, not in front of their group. So next slide. So this is something not just with teens, but all of them, is we have a tendency to make it about us when there's conflict. And this, and you want to do this with the teenager because you've been there and you know it will get better and you know it sucks and you kind of want to like give your adult wisdom. But if you go into a teenager and they're saying and they're upset about like, oh, this broke up or my mom did this or whatever, and you're like, yeah, I remember when my mom did this. Well, now you've just invalidated them. You've tried to one up their pain. And if you haven't experienced what they're doing, you don't have to say, well, I don't know why you're so upset. Why are you crying? You can say, you know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So we sometimes make it about us. When someone else is stressed and takes it out on us like a patron, maybe our first reaction would be like, well, let me tell you about my day. Do you know what we've been dealing with in the back room right now? We make it about us, and that really actually can escalate the situation rather than de-escalate it. Next slide. Okay, so this is some more scripts and some role playing. We're kind of moving into that, but I want to pause for a minute if anyone has any comments or thoughts or questions on any of that. I'm also curious if we have teen services librarians in the house around here that have to or work with a lot with young people.
Not seeing anything in the chat box at the moment.
Yeah, we'll save some time for the end, and I love making this tailored to you. So if you have anything you want to add, please chime in there. So as I mentioned earlier, I was a teen service librarian in kind of a very, very, very busy place with lots of conflict, and that's when I started researching, because yeah, library school didn't teach me any of that. Was verbal judo is what I stumbled upon, and I used this a lot in as a librarian, taught on this, and I am going to teach you some of the basics of verbal judo. So it comes from a book, and George J. Thompson was a former, was in law enforcement, formerly in law enforcement, and him and his company have trained law enforcement across the country. And you're like, well, I'm not in law enforcement. I'm like, are you? So because librarians are in public spaces just like cops are, and they have rules just like cops are. And so I'm not saying that you're a cop. Of course you're not. But you are probably seeing similar things as law enforcement, and you are dealing with conflict situations just like law enforcement. So understanding some basic concepts of verbal judo can help. And one of them is the empathy piece, and that was that quote earlier. But it de-escalates conflict. It's about listening better, learning what not to say, learning what to say, and stopping verbal attacks in their tracks. Now, I got to add a caveat on this. If someone, you know, can't reason, young children, they no, or those that are mentally ill, I would not necessarily recommend some of this. This is from people whose to a certain extent, their prefrontal cortex are working a little bit. They can make some long-term rational decision making. But that's the book. There's a website, and I found the book, and I've read it a few different times. Very helpful. So go to the next slide. So this is one technique to stop conflict in its tracks. So I was in one situation with a particular teen years ago. There was a lot of ongoing conflict with this individual. There got to one point where she tried to grab the gun of the police officer who was on our library staff. This was tough, but I had successfully used this paraphrasing technique with her to kind of take it down a notch, so it didn't get to trying to grab a gun. I don't know what would have happened that was stopped, but things would escalate very quickly with this individual, and things can escalate very quickly with teenagers because, as I said, they're not rational long-term decision making is tougher for them from an individual. So paraphrasing, someone's very, very upset, you kind of stop them a little bit in your tracks with that word of insertion. So you're showing that you're listening. You're not saying this rudely, but you're stopping them to kind of, because sometimes people get even more wound up. So you're stopping it a little bit, and then you're adding an empathetic sentence. I want to make sure I understand what's happening here. And you say that very calmly, and then get them a chance to talk, because sometimes people just kind of go on a little bit of a rant, and they're like a train, and they are barreling through the station. So pausing and allowing them to speak a little bit and kind of let them summarize helps, and then you paraphrase it. Okay, if I understand, and then you give them an opportunity to correct you, this happened. But because sometimes what we want to do is we want to go into a conflict situation and be like, everyone out! you know, or this we want to say because I said so and just stop it right there. But this can be a way to de-escalate things by being empathetic and giving them a chance to say what's going on and then paraphrase, because what you think is the problem might not actually be the problem. You're walking in, often when we walk into these conflict situations, we're walking in after they've started. These conflict situations with teens started at lunch and it is continuing now. So we need to give them a chance. Next slide. So on that, so paraphrase is just one. Paraphrase is good for, like, there's an argument happening right now. That kind of calms it down a little bit, but overall this is something that's, maybe it hasn't gotten to the yelling place. It's the leaps. It's from verbal judo. Listen, emphasize, ask, paraphrase, summarize. So I said paraphrase is for the short term, but if you a longer term, full way to do it is the leaps. So we're listening to what they're saying. We're empathizing with what we're saying. We're asking clarifying questions. We react with curiosity, not criticism. We paraphrase what's going. And so the extra step on the end is summarizing. So paraphrase is like, you can do that a few times because you might be asking for clarification. Oh, I think this happened. Can you explain? And then they might say something. Okay, to make sure I understood. And then at the very end, you summarize the whole situation, make sure we're all in agreement before you go on. And maybe you summarize and say, okay, well, you know, she hit you and that's not appropriate for the library. You all need to go. And that's when you kind of cast judgment after you summarize the situation. Next slide. So here are some other scripts. So I gave you a little bit with our paraphrasing and our leaps on verbal judo, but I want to give you a few other scripts and advice and suggestions here. So this is from John Gottman, and there's some similarities you can see with verbal judo here. So Gottman and judo are saying a lot of the same stuff. So as you're listening was the first step of leaps, but Gottman uses the word witness. And I like that term witness, is that you're acknowledging their feelings, you're noticing them, you're witnessing their feelings, and you give some kind of empathetic statement. I know this is hard. Now I've witnessed the feelings, I've observed them, I've listened, I'm affirming that it is okay for them to be upset. Now this is something that we don't always like to do with teens, because we're like, why are you so upset? What's the big deal? Why are you making a big deal about this? We do this with coworkers, we do this with partners. We don't understand why they're upset, and so we might criticize, but they have a right to be upset. Now we might not agree with it. We might think they're being silly, but they have a right to their feelings. So we need to affirm their feelings. And then you draw them out. And this is kind of that paraphrase, summarize, ask, that part of the leaps is helping them understand. But so often this is what Gottman teaches, that we have those four horsemen of divorce. Criticize, so someone expresses that they're upset. And we're like, why are you upset? You didn't do anything. We have defensiveness, so someone expresses that that they're upset, and we get, well, I didn't do anything. We also get stonewalling. When someone expresses their feelings, we don't even respond or we ignore them. And the worst of them from John Gottman is contempt. And that is when someone expresses feelings or brings something up that we say, well, you're a confused, stupid person. And that's when it gets contempt. And when it gets that bad, then it's really hard to pull back from that. So we have to react with curiosity instead of some of our natural impulses. Next slide. So I want to talk about this concept, another strategy that you can have, which is mental forecasting. Now I mentioned the term defensive pessimism that can be good in certain situations, but I need to add, a little addendum to that, is we're not really good about predicting what things will happen. We think we are. You might see this a lot, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get this promotion and life is going to be awesome forever and everything's going to work out. And so our happiness levels go up when something happens, but actually it goes down pretty quickly to a baseline. We feel, oh, if I get this pair of shoes, I get this or whatever, I'll be, no. You see this even with lottery winners. I don't know if you've ever watched some of those documentaries on previous lottery winners. They're fascinating. People win the lottery, And they're like, ah, and they actually end up feeling about the same as they did before. So if you go in, this is that statement, if you go into a situation wanting to feel happy, you make it sometimes harder to attain because we have these very, very high expectations and we're let down. So when we are in a conflict situations, we should not necessarily enter it with trying to win, with trying to feel better. We have to say, okay, this is gonna suck. Defensive pessimism, this is gonna feel bad, but I will get through it. So that you could say to yourself, so this is one of the scripts that I would recommend if you're going into a conflict situation. You're going to say, I gotta go into this. I'm not going to feel good about it. I am scared. I am nervous, but I can do this. So I remember, as I told you that story, I had to go into mediation, and that was highly stressful. Walking into that, you know there's going to be conflict when there's mediation. There's strong feeling. There's all this kind of going on there. But I gave myself kind of a script, because if I went in saying, this is going to be awesome and everything's going to be perfect, or if I go in and say, oh, it's the end of the world, well, that's not very helpful. So acknowledging your own feelings, acknowledging that conflict sucks, but also acknowledging you'll get through it. So another thing, so mental forecasting can really help us as we go into conflict situations, and be aware that we're not very good sometimes at forecasting. But in conflict situations, giving options and consequences. And we're not always good about doing this with children, but even young children, you can give them choices. I remember, going through the terrible threes. They talk about the terrible twos, but there's also the terrible threes with my kid, but even at age 3, giving a choice. Well, you can choose to, eat what I gave you, or you can not have food, until later. You got to eat something. And even giving a 3-year-old some kind of choice, well, you have a choice between watching this or watching that, really helps that, it gives the 3-year-old practice from to making choices, but also shows a level of respect. But we sometimes don't always give options and consequences, especially with our younger people. So here's some examples I put on this board about options and consequences. Continue. You can talk here, you can talk outside. So I'm not saying go outside, you're talking too much. I'm saying you have choices. And sometimes the choices are not good. I have kicked out a lot of people in the library over the years. I'm not saying that to brag, but sometimes people have to go because of certain behaviors, and that's a choice. And framing it in you have to do this or you have to leave, I mean, yeah, it seems like a false choice, but it's better than saying leave now. They usually go quieter. It doesn't escalate the situation when I've had to kick people out and I give them a choice. And, sometimes I've had teens that I've kicked out, they made a choice and they've come back a little bit, apologetic. So giving options and consequences, and coming up with those scripts, if-then statements. So go to the next slide, and we're getting through our last part here, and then I will give some time for questions at the end. I wanted to give you some practical advice as well. So this is something we're not good about. I already mentioned nonverbal behaviors. We want to make sure our tone is matching our face, is matching our rest of our body, but we're not always good. These are things you should never say. Never say never. If you say that to anyone, even not just a teenager, well, you never do the dishes, they will remember the one time that they did. Because really, when we generalize, we just kind of shut the conversation down. So Gottman talks about generalizations a lot too, is because if you go into a conflict, you want to go in with a soft statement, a soft touch. But starting with the generalization starts the conflict in a hard way. So you might have a legitimate complaint, so you're not getting enough help at home, your partner is not doing the dishes and the laundry or whatever the most. And that's a legitimate complaint, and you should speak up. But if you go in saying you never do the laundry, I always do the dishes, well, you've just, the conversation just kind of goes out the window, because people immediately get defensive. I like to say there's always an exception to always. So instead of saying you never communicate, you use the I words, I feel our communication can improve. So to use this in a library setting, you could say, well, you never listen to me in the you never follow the rules. You always fight with your classmates. You can say, I feel like there's a lot of conflict in this library. What do you think we can do to make it better? So let's never use those generalizations. So next slide. So I'm going to kind of start wrapping up. We had a quieter group here, but I left some time at the end. I know I gave you a lot of information, but I want to kind of go one more slide a little bit more, Jessica, so I could go through our book list, and then you can start typing some questions and some thoughts. So this is the book list that I pulled in things from this book. So if you want to add anything on there, I mentioned The Upside of Your Dark Side. A similar book is that Out of Character book, Surprising Truths About the Liar, Cheat, Sinner, and Saint. And it talks a lot about, in that book, the situations we're in, because you might have someone who is exhibiting, a colleague that's exhibiting some negative behavior, but at home they might be just fine. And something in the library, something with the boss, some kind of life situation caused them to be that way. So, being careful about judging people. I mentioned Verbal Judo. This is probably the most famous book by John Gottman, is The 7 Principles for Making a Marriage Work, but a lot of those principles can become applied to any kind of conflict situation with colleagues. And then some of the stats around our physical reactions to stress is The Body Keeps Score. It's a great book that talks about the effects of everything. So if you want to move back one more slide, Jessica, with my contact information, and we'll look over some questions and we can talk about some of these things here.
Sure, yeah. So far there's just been one question. How do we learn more about mental forecasting?
Yeah, so there's a great podcast that I'm trying to remember the name of it as well. I think it was like something around decisions, but Hidden Brain is one of my favorite podcasts. I don't know if everyone listened to it, by NPR. And some of the things that I pulled out was how we make decisions. If I had my phone, I'd pull it up and I'd tell you the right one. But that is a good one. And thinking of just searching for mental forecasting, but Hidden Brain actually covers a few of these concepts that we talked about in this presentation, and that is one of them on decisions.
Yeah, that's a great list of resources. And somebody's asking if we'll be sending out an email with a link to share with colleagues that were unable to see, and copies of the slides. And yes, definitely with your permission, we'll be sharing a link to the recording and the slides as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Other thoughts? And I love to hear what you're dealing with. I shared some stories, some embarrassing little stories of my own. You must be like, Carrie, no wonder you left libraries. But
that's exactly what I was thinking. When you talked about somebody grabbing a gun, I was like, oh, I wonder why you don't work with the public anymore.
That wasn't the reason I left, but it made some hard days, I won't lie. So.
Yeah, and somebody's sharing that they work with college students, so some of them are teens, 17 to 19, and young 20s. Do you think some of the teen advice applies, or do you have additional suggestions, I guess, for that age range?
Yeah, a lot of the teen advice will applies until, probably, 20 or so. Girls typically reach that prefrontal cortex and that emotional maturity a little sooner than guys. So, keep that in mind. No offense, guys, but on that peer influence piece, that's a big difference. Is it our younger teens have that higher level of peer influence? And so in terms of like risks of alcohol abuse and drugs, a lot of prevention and nonprofits focus on that junior high age. Like if you're going to do something, and some of the stats that I've read, if you're going to drop out of school, or you're going to engage in substance abuse, you usually do it by 9th grade. So you're dealing with some of the same emotional issues for that older teens, but not the peer influence issues as much. They're a little more independent that way.
And we have another question from a group. We wonder if you have strategies for working with people experiencing mental illness.
Yeah, this is a hard one, and as I said, I can't use verbal judo as well in some of those situations. I guess it depends on what kind of mental illness that they're dealing with, and sometimes you don't know if they have a mental illness or something else. But I do remember experience. We had a lot of homeless around our library, and how do I say this? In some situations, letting them just talk to themselves, and they would just kind of sit there and talk to themselves, and letting them be. Does that make sense when I say that? Like we just because they weren't violent, and I think getting too involved, if they aren't harming and no one's complaining or it's not an issue, can cause more issues than it's worth. Now, I'm not a therapist by any means. I think understanding how the biology works when we're under stress with those with high rates of anxiety can help us deal with that. But ones that are very, very mentally ill, sometimes my advice would be, and if they're not upsetting anyone, don't escalate the situation and just kind of let them be.
Yeah, we actually did a series last winter, and some of it regarded mental illness. So we do have a YouTube video
Good.
available at srlc.org, and then on our YouTube page from last year. So that might help.
Yeah.
And they were adding to that passive aggressiveness as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've done that. That's a popular one I've done. And yes, we talked about some of these concepts, and I do give scripts with passive-aggressive behavior, but that webinar I actually focus on the causes of passive-aggressive behavior. And I mentioned that a little bit here, is like, what are the systems that are causing this behavior? Maladaptive behavior can be adaptive in certain situations, and so that's a big thesis of what I talk about in passive-aggressive behavior, is the systems that's promoting that behavior.
And somebody's asking, have you seen the 2-hour verbal judo video on YouTube? And if yes, is it worth a view, or should I just stick to the book?
I haven't, but that's partly because I'm a librarian. I'm not a big YouTuber. I like to listen to audiobooks and podcasts and read. So that's the reason I haven't looked at it. But I think that you could probably get through the 2-hour video quicker than you could the book. But the book is actually kind of small. But what's nice about the book is you can turn to the chapters that are most relevant to you and skip ahead and have it right there.
And then somebody was sharing, our most difficult patron recently was a retired faculty member. I'm not sure that anything would have diffused him, as he was engaging in bullying behavior to get what he wanted, which was something we were legally not allowed to give him.
Yeah.
And all the calm explanations had no impact, but I can see how I might have tried some of these techniques to stop us going in circles.
Yeah, the paraphrasing technique there, but that's a hard situation, and I think the why of he's retired, he's maybe lost some of his power and authority. He's used to being in charge, and all of a sudden he's not in charge. To use an internet example, he was a Karen, used to being in charge, and now not in charge, and wanting to talk to the manager. So there wasn't much you could do. It sounds like he wanted to assert some level of control and authority that he didn't have, and so letting him just exhaust himself was probably in some ways the best way to do it.
Yeah, and then we have another person sharing, we have a few patrons who are rude to other patrons or staff occasionally, but aren't always caught doing it, just reported by other patrons, or they run off immediately afterwards, and working on addressing it directly with them on respectful behavior, not interfering with other patrons' use of the library.
Yeah, yeah. And that's hard too, because you don't always know what's happening between them. You're not in the conflict, because I dealt with that sometimes with the teens, as I wouldn't see what was happening, I'd only see the after effects. So it's hard to know, what's happening in a situation, but the leaps can at least give everyone a chance to kind of say what's happening and paraphrase and summarize can help you understand, because you're probably going to catch it later in the end.
And another question, can you suggest resources for more tips on communicating with teens during conflicts? Example, they blow me off when I ask them not to do X, Y, or Z, or deny doing X, Y, and Z when I saw them do it.
Yeah, so there's some great, I've heard like positive parenting, that concept. There's some good books around positive parenting a bit as well, that have some of those techniques. I think Gottman has a parenting book as well, but I like the concepts of in that. There also is a training and a company called Why Try that focuses on work with at-risk adolescents, and they have some really good lessons and instructions in the Why Try curriculum that I like.
Great, thank you. And then can you talk more about dealing with narcissistic coworkers? All of the positives you mentioned aren't exactly the case in my situation. It's more overblown than that.
No.
And approaching this coworker to discuss problems is very difficult because of the self-centeredness.
Yeah. So, and I don't know if it's a coworker or a boss. A boss, it makes it a lot harder. But I find that sometimes the narcissism thrives when we don't have clear agendas and meetings and times. I find that, like, this is a pet peeve of mine. When narcissists love a group meeting because they can get on their soapbox and kind of like have an audience. So one way you could do is having a very specific a moderator, and who is in charge of that meeting really reins it in, because they'll just run roughshod over you in a meeting situation. What you can also do if you're going into a conversation with the narcissist, say, hey, I only got like 5 minutes. And try to cut it short a little bit as well. And then also going in with those I feel statements, instead of, shutting it, it'll shut down a little bit if you go in with the defensiveness criticism. If you can also have a witness, sometimes that helps. I've been in situations where, there's some egos and some things being said that shouldn't be said, and having a witness can help as well.
And we just had a comment from a Karen who resents
the
mean
sorry.
things.
I'm sure the Chads hate it too. I know. That's a poor example, but there are some people that just like to assert power and authority, and sometimes they gotta. That sounds like that retired professor.
And just regarding teen resources, somebody had suggested A Teen Walks into the Library by the Colorado State Library. It's a fantastic training, and it's online and free.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. I haven't heard of that one.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's all I'm seeing for questions. And I did want to mention before we close that this webinar is part of a series on leadership and management that we're doing. And I'd like to invite you all to the next webinar in the series, which is on from change management to change readiness. That's on February 27th, 10 to 11:30 a.m. if you'd like to join us. And thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And we'll be sending out a link to the recording and the slides to everybody. So thank you all for being here, and have a good day.
Bye.